started. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We're going through maps of meaning. Roger, Claire, and Victor are leading the charge. Over to you guys.
All right. Well, first and foremost, thank you everyone for joining us on this Saturday. Today we'll be discussing the Great Father, and that's for anyone who's been following us so far. The Great Father's representation of order. So just kind of to give us a general introduction of what it is we're actually aiming for, so everyone kind of understands what we're trying to get at today. This breakdown of the Great Father, what is it and how it relates to chaos and directly to you. We'll also be discussing the two sides of the Great Father. Much like the Great Mother, like we discussed last week, the Great Father also has its positive and negative valence. And finally, we'll close with the challenges that all of us must face and why they must be faced. But before we jump to all that, let's go ahead and get oriented into some of the things that we'll be talking about. So these are just some of the toolboxes that we're going to use from previous lectures and some of the goals for today. So first one, just remembering that idea of gods as fundamental motivational forces. In other words, that a lot of times the motivations that we're born with were oftentimes conceived as gods, as deities, and as personalities within us that could drive us and control us in many ways. And then remembering the Great Father, again, for anyone who didn't make it to that lecture, the Great Father is the counterpart to the Great Mother, is the representation of culture and order. And from the fifth lecture, understanding and remembering that the unknown tends to always be the source of fear. If we know what's ahead of us, we don't really have a reason to be afraid. In the same sense, we can anticipate what's going on. And finally, one last one. For this lecture, I do recommend that we empty the word spirit. I think that's a very charged term, especially for anyone who is religious, or especially if you're not religious, because then that idea gets really hard to grasp. But for this point, just kind of thinking of what culturally we think of as spirit, the definition of something that doesn't die, something that lives on and continues past us, and being open to maybe a different interpretation of what you would normally presume is a spirit. Now, for the goals for today, the first one is we would like to get to a point where we can understand where the Great Father comes from, how it originates, especially from the mythic perspective. To understand the Great Father's connection to God and society, understanding the concept of the spirit of the Father, and understanding both sides of the Great Father, the positive and the negative. And then finally, also understanding the four problems that arise once the Great Mother and the Great Father are in play, and understanding why choosing a forward path isn't optional. But to get us all started, we'll start where Peterson starts off, and that's going to be in the discussion with culture. As we covered in the previous lecture, today we'll be talking about the Great Father, and it's most representative most broadly of order, and just as importantly, the things that bring order out of chaos. But importantly here, the distinction is systems that do that. So not necessarily the individual, because that's more of the hero archetype, but the system that's already in place that allows the hero to even exist in this domain. I'm going to kind of go a little bit Peterson-like and just list a bunch of things that are order, so you can kind of understand that the thing that all these things have in common is what we're trying to point at. So this is God. This is the state. This is the culture. This is the tribe. This is the Father. Right? But why is it that this archetype is associated with these ideas, and how do they connect? To begin, we should consider Peterson's point at the start of the lecture. How did culture with human beings evolve? How was it transferred? How were we able to get to the point where we are, considering, if you look at almost every other animal that exists on this planet, they don't seem to function in a similar way. There's something about us that we can maintain information and pass it down to the next generation. And then Peterson points out that's like, well, we've only actually been literate for about 500 years. And what he means by that is literally to the general population. There's always been the elites that were more educated, but he points out it's like even that written history was only 5,000 years ago. But we have evidence that there's been human culture as far back as 150,000 years ago. So given these facts, we can ask, how was culture passed down? And this will be the main focus, as it's through this question that we can find how archetypes, especially the archetype of the Great Father, develops and are transferred. So before we get into that, let's go ahead and establish a couple of things about culture and about society. As we discussed before, both animals and people do actions first, right? We act first, and it's not until later that we actually abstract a representation of that. Some of the examples we've covered are wolves, chimps, rats. They all show their social structure to resemble to have rules which are not articulated, but are followed and enforced. Animals seem to act within boundaries that, though the animal doesn't understand that there's rules, if the rules are broken, all the animals react in a similar way. And it seems to be an established norm that couldn't be articulated in language, but seems to still exist. More specifically, the structure that the rules form is hierarchical in nature. In other words, what those rules start to push social animals to is to a more hierarchical structure in their social dynamics. And we know that humans and many other social animals tend to organize themselves in a hierarchy, and that tends to start to form a social order of one way or another. So a hierarchy arises naturally, and it can be, and one of the criticisms that's sometimes been laid to Peterson is that like his view of a hierarchy is too single-minded, but I don't think that's actually a criticism, because it doesn't really matter how the hierarchy itself functions, just that there is a hierarchy is what's actually important, than the maintenance of that hierarchy. And for Peterson, the hierarchy's been around so long, so much longer than we're even aware of, that it's actually played a part in our evolution, right? That it was part of us before we were even human, and that hierarchy was always shaping how we were developed. So we have the hierarchy, and we have the hierarchy as a part of the evolutionary process. So then the next question is, how is it that we adapted to that? And this is where culture comes in. So culture is essentially the traditions, attitudes, and customs and behaviors that humans pass down to one another. Now, considering Peterson's first question of how this is transferred, there's several ways that it could be, especially relevant to our points. One is stories, another one's imitation, another one's drama, right? Ways that we used that weren't written, but still share the information. And all of these play a role in this process. So let's start first and foremost with stories. Humans always have a tendency to interpret parts of the world as personified forms. We do this often, for example, even if you're just on your phone and you can't bring something up on your phone, you'll sometimes, it's very common to say, it's like, oh, it's still thinking. Or if I, for example, this New Year's, if I say, it's like, oh, no, me and tequila have a bad relationship, right? Everyone understands what I mean, but that sentence doesn't make any sense. Like, it's not an actual, like there's no way to actually make sense of that. But the personification of inanimate objects is a very common way of telling the story, of adding a personality to different things because it's similar like. So similar to last week, when we talked about the mother as a representation of the world, because of the natural relationship with the child, and to refresh from the child's perspective, the mother is the world, partly because it is the mother who determines what aspects of the world the child is exposed to. So considering that process of using what you know to explain what you don't, how would someone describe the hierarchical culture that you're born into and raised in? What would it look like, and what would be its qualities? So here's, for anyone who is interested, and I know a couple of people have mentioned it, a quick dive into Peterson's theory of God. And I say quick because I'm going to try to touch on this and then keep going because it's a giant hole we could fall into. But to get to my point, I'm going to paraphrase Jordan Peterson. And by this, I mean, some of these are his words, some of these are mine. I was trying to kind of explain more, but I noticed that a lot of times Peterson just is so concise and good that there's no other way to reword it. But when he's talking about God, he's setting up this I'm going to set up this general idea of how information is transferred and what exactly is being transferred. So in this section, one final thing, please keep in mind that you should please keep an open mind when considering the word spirit and what it might actually mean. So he starts, we have this idea that there's a God that is father-like. It's a disembodied spirit that is eternal and has parental characteristics. Now, if we strip the claim of its metaphysics, in other words, ignore the religious claims, ignore what they're saying it does, but rather look at what it could possibly be a reference to, what might that idea be pointing to? What could it be a reflection of? Well, there's your father, and if this God is fatherly, there has to be some commonality there. So there's your father, and there's something about him that makes him father compared to other men. He acts towards you in a way that ideally is more father-like than a stranger. The relation between the two elicits a different behavior and attitude that is what makes him father. So is that that could be possibly what we're talking about, right? Then the next conclusion you might draw is, well, then that's what it is. You are imitating your father, and that's how you learn the father role, right? That works, but then you realize something more interesting, which is your father didn't just learn that randomly. He learned it from his father, mimicking his father. And his father was mimicking his own father. And his father was mimicking his own father. So the pattern of father that was being copied was never a single individual, but rather a pattern across fathers. And at that point, Peterson points to the fact that there's an eternal spirit of the father. Because what is a spirit, right? If not something that doesn't exist in the physical realm, doesn't die, can outlive any one of us, and can affect us. All right, well, look at the pattern of a father being, and you have this spirit of father that seems to be within all of us. And Peterson continues. He says, when a child imitates their father, they're not pretending to be their father. They are watching through several situations, then abstracting commonalities in behavior and attitude across situations that make him father. Then the child incorporates that and dramatizes it in play and pretend play. This is his quote. It's unbelievably complex. What the child is learning to do is embody the disembodied spirit of the father. Well, what is that disembodied spirit? It's the disembodied spirit that is incarnated in the collective of fathers across time. All right? And what is that? What is its function? What does it do? Well, first and foremost, it's a judge. Even when you interact with the hierarchy of men who are alive, that can be seen as the patriarchal spirit. And if you think that thing is not judging you, you're not paying attention. That's what rank orders you in the hierarchy. So, cutting from Peterson, what actually is this paternal spirit? It's culture personified. It's the great weight of your past. You are not born out of culture, but rather always within one. And as you're developing, you learn the routines, you learn the ritual. They structure your interpretations, your motor output, as well as your own conceptualizations of what you're dealing with, of when you're dealing with other people. This is how you learn the cultural rules. The integration of the father is the integration of the rules of the social game. So now going to the diagram, which is similar to the mother chaos. The father is also the offspring or the son of the Ouroboros, the totality, right? Because the totality is the son of is the birthplace of everything. Now, similar to the Great Mother, when we encounter it, it can have two valences. In other words, it can appear to us in two forms, the positive side and the negative side of the great. But for both of them, it is the overseer of the state, the judge of all, the God, the sun, consciousness, the provider of safety, the creator of tyrants. So let's dive a little bit more first into what exactly the Great Father fully breaks down into. And then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the embodiment of those archetypes. And Claire, did you want to jump in with anything here yet?
No, beautiful.
Perfect. All right. So let's start with the nice guy first. So first and foremost, is the Great Father is, in the positive sense, is normally recognized as the Benevolent King, the ruler that actually means well. And you can see this a lot of times even represented in myth, right? Normally, it's a lot of times the king isn't the main character, but he's in the background. And he can either be a tyrant, which is what the hero is fighting against, or he can be the Benevolent King, which is normally the person that recruits the hero to get him to do something that's actually good for the town that he needs. But what is it that the good side of the king provides or offers you? What happens if you heed what he wants? Well, first and foremost, it's safety and security. And adherence to the structure allows you to move around without the fear of other groups or tribes attacking you or your loved ones, something that most of modern people aren't too aware of, or at least not in the West, but in plenty of other countries, that's still very much a reality. And we'll discuss a little bit later that for Freud, the security can be extended to salvation from death itself. For Freud, he believed that God was kind of like your sky daddy. Like, once you grow out of your childhood, you still have that slot for a dad that can solve problems you can't. And death is a problem you can't solve. So then you create a sky father that can solve that. But he also deals with fairness and justice. It's the idea that things will be dealt with at least in a somewhat fair way, or at least more fair than the alternative state of nature, where whoever is strongest decides what happens. This is an example of something mentioned a couple of lectures ago when we discussed the emergent games and how you will only play games that at least satisfy some of your emotional needs, enough to justify participating in them. The king also provides justice and sometimes retribution if you were to be wronged. So even if things don't play out fairly, you have the law, you have the police, you have the military, and they all serve the structure of the king. And the structure ideally protects you. So if someone does hurt you or kill you, the police will go and find them. Even if you're not there, even if it's not part of your, not part of your ability, there'll be something that follows through. It creates a known and predictable space. It creates an environment for you and others to interact in a way that is standard, predictable, and with the least amount of novelty possible. It simplifies your life so each interaction with another can be approached as though there's no immediate possible threat. In other words, when you go shopping, you don't have to bring your Glock, you don't have to pack a knife just in case, the cashier tries to steal your money when you pull out your wallet. Most of those are pretty much already dealt with. There's a standardized way of being, and you can reliably predict how your day is going to play out. It also creates a community and belonging. It offers you a team to be a part of. To be a part of something bigger than yourself. It allows you to belong somewhere. It gives you the means to create friendships and companionships in a very simplified way. Additionally, status and reward. It creates a game that rewards you. Unlike chaos, where anything can happen, order attempts to limit chaos as much as is reasonable to make sure that the ones climbing the hierarchy are proportionally rewarded. In other words, if you do what the king wants you to do, the king will be kind, the king will be nice, it'll give you what you would like. And in doing so, it gives you an internal structural goal to work towards and increasing rewards the more you succeed. The way you can think of this is almost all your goals, which we've already determined is essentially what gives you a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose and essentially regulates your mood. Almost all your goals are determined much more by your society than by chaos or anything else, right? You want to get that next job. You want to get that new education. You want to get that new status. We're all constantly climbing these games. And it's also tacit and inherited. In other words, you don't have to earn or buy your way in. Plenty of fathers, both male, female, and everything in between, before you have sacrificed themselves to gift you this system that you've inherited. It is your birthright and your responsibility. These are some of the perks when you have the good side of the king. But just like the great mother, he also has the bad side. And the bad side is the inherited risk of offering all these rewards. Claire, did you have any comments or anything?
No.
Perfect. So the Benevolent King can also become the Devouring King. And the reason I only strike through the previous slides and put other ones is because this is quite literally the flip side of the coin. In order to give you one, it requires the other one. So the safety and security that we all enjoy, well, there's a cost to that. And the cost is, it's the Devouring King that takes our young men and sends them to war. It also enforces laws regardless of your opinion, whether you agree with them or not. And the safety and security of the structure is above you as an individual. In other words, anything, if it ever becomes a choice between the structure or you, you're not the priority at all, ever. And fairness and justice naturally leads to corruption and power. Corruption exists in every system, and it can grow to the extent that that makes fairness impossible. Power and influence can also tip the scales of justice. Creating a known and predictable domain for you to live in, well, that also requires regulations and punishment when you don't. You are restricted in what you can do, and society is not interested in you as an individual. They are interested in you in accordance to its needs. In other words, for a society, they're not interested in your art. They're not interested in your expression. What can you do to help society? Right? There is no time for your personal exploration. We don't care about that. We care of like what you can do for us. It's a genuine benefit for everyone, but there's a loss there and there's an imposition there too. And you must act in a way that's expected, or you'll find that there's social enforcement of some kind. Now, this can range from the benign to the extreme. If you go walk around naked, it's like you'll get looks, you'll get comments, you might even get the police called on you and arrested. If you go around stealing things and just taking whatever you'd like and being impulsive, the consequences grow the more deviant you become. Now, that community and belonging, well, that also requires uniformity and conformity. You are expected to format your thoughts, attitudes, behaviors, and likes, and many other aspects of you for the sake of the social sphere. It is your conformity with others that allows you to, on a small scale, have things in common, and on the large scale, be able to communicate at all. So you can think of it as, on the small scale, for example, I recently started playing fantasy football. I'm not a very big football guy myself, but I hang out a lot with a lot of my friends, and they all can name drop, at least dozens of players, and I have no idea what any of them are. But they invited me to play fantasy football, and I actually put an effort. I started to do some research. I would like set my lineup. And what I found was, as I got more informed and conformed to this norm that everyone else already was in, I was actually able to engage and relate to them in a much better way. I could talk to them about, it's like, oh, Ezekiel Elliott, and he's he killed me this week. He could have done so much better. And like there's a genuine bonding that happens with my conformity. On the extreme scale is, you can imagine just someone who doesn't even speak your language. There's no way of communicating. So there's a necessity of a conformity to be able to even communicate. Now, the bad side of the status and rewards, well, there's the greed and cheating. Once you've created a game with a reward that is valued, humans are naturally going to try and win, and many will value the reward more than anything else. which leads to cheating in the hierarchy. This is, essentially I live in DC, so this is what a lot of people perceive the top parts of the hierarchy as doing. Nepotism, lobbying, all these senses of corruption for the sake of the reward. And more importantly, the greed can also show itself, since the people who are at the top of the hierarchy are also inclined to amass the most rewards, as they're in the best position to do so unjustly, right? The richer you are, the easier it is to get more money. The more powerful you are, the easier it is to attain more power. And finally, the fact that it's inherited and that your consent is tacit, it also means that you're trapped and burdened by the system. You have no choice. You are born in the system and you must survive it. It is your burden. So as you can see, it brings both the benefits and the drawbacks of order. It is a constant balance, and as Peterson has warned, hierarchies tilt towards tyranny, and this is why, right? The longer it goes on, the more opportunity there is for the devouring king to manifest itself. A little callback to the Egyptian myth. The devouring king is Set, and the benevolent king is Osiris. Osiris is the benevolent king. He's the thing that established the order, but he's old. He's, starting to get a little senile. He's not what he used to be. And Set has been biding his time, waiting for a chance to overthrow him. This pattern is a common theme among myths and religions. Now, interestingly enough, and Peterson makes this point, the slow corrosion of our ancient religious structures at the hands of science made religion less acceptable. Around that same time, a new science arose to attempt to explain our behavior. And Peterson notes that Sigmund Freud created a secular look at our psyche with very peculiar separations of that psyche. And this is, for anyone who's not aware, this is a real quick and not at all deep enough breakdown of Freud's psyche, but we're going to do just a quick recap. So for Freud, he believed that the psyche was broken down into three different parts: the id, the superego, and the ego. Now, the id was the nature or instinct part of the brain. It had all your natural desires. It held your most primal urges. These were the urges that we would love to do, but we know we shouldn't. And the reason we know we shouldn't is because of the superego. And the superego is the socializing, society, culture, where we internalize our sense of morality, and the way we work, it's the moral standard that we hold ourselves to that is a reflection of the culture around us. And then the ego was the thing that regulates between the two, the thing that is deciding what parts of the id get acted out and get passed through the superego, and what parts of the superego are internalized and used to repress other aspects. So Peterson points out that you can actually see how the mythological structure is underpinning this theory. The id is essentially functions as in a more restricted sense as the Great Mother. It is the nature you are born with. It is our instincts and part of us that are within us, and are the parts of us that are within us that we were born with. They're also beyond our control, and in many times we're at their mercy. The superego functions very similarly to the Great Father. It's the tradition that is being kept alive and passed down by each generation. It is the judge that tells you what is right and wrong. It informs you of what is in moral accordance with what you were taught. And then the ego is the divine child or the hero. It is the aspect that must navigate between those two forces. In Freud's eyes, the ego is very enthusiastic and excited about life, and they go out there. And it's the superego's responsibility to repress it and shut it down. And Peterson points out that this is almost exactly like when you see children. They're the perfect example of this. Most children are ecstatic to be alive. They're happier than anyone else you'll ever meet. They're just yelling around and having a blast. And it's the parents' job, the parents in Peterson's perspective, playing the Great Father, to shut that down. Your kid's playing tag in the line where everyone else is orderly and filed. Hey, stop. If they don't stop, punishment until you do stop. It's like, I have more resources, more power and everything else. You will not win, kid. Like, I can outplay you in everything. And in the same way, we're in the take that one step level, one step higher, and that's exactly the same position we find ourselves in with society. You can fight as much as you can, but there's the benefits and the oppression that naturally comes with society. And just a fun note here, Jung was a huge fan and apprentice of Freud, and they were actually friends for quite a while before they eventually had a fallout. And Jung is for those who don't know, Jung is a psychologist that develops the theory of archetypes, which is now where we're going to jump to, as we were talking earlier about about Peterson's point of the spirit of the father, as to how all this happens. So returning to the metamyth, and for those that don't know, this Peterson's framework is, he calls it sometimes the metamyth, which is essentially just a myth about how myths are created. That's the only reason it's such a fancy name. But to explain this diagram, you have the totality in the background, right? All things, which then give birth to this image, which is the Great Father. He's the God. In the previous image, he has the Son behind him too, and he's looking over the state, the city. And this is whenever this occurs, it occurs because there is an order of some form that is manifested, or that's already there. Now, the order can be security or tyranny, which leads to the affect of safety or suffocation. So what this means is, when you encounter order, it can be perceived as two ways, positive or negative. If it's positive, you perceive it as security. And if it's perceived as security, the sensation you get is safety. If it's seen negative, you perceive it as a tyranny. And the sensation that you then receive is suffocation. And that's what leads to the Devouring Father and the Benevolent Father. Now, as we discussed earlier, about the spirit of the father, let's bring it back down to a little bit more practical, to actual fathers. So as a father, you have to embody a role. Ideally, you are both of these, naturally, because you, on the one hand, are a benevolent father. You are providing, nurturing, caring, and supporting. You want to nurture your children to be the best that they can be. But on the other hand, you do have to be somewhat tyrannical. You don't set up a democratic vote with your kids as to what's for dinner. You don't set up a democratic vote with your kids as to what's going to happen. Like, you tell them what is going to happen. You impose order, you impose rules, and you enforce them. So what then happens when the child experiences this? So as the child is watching their father and imitating them in play, the child is abstracting the role of father. And Peterson uses an example of sharing here to make it clear as to just how complex this system actually, this process actually is. The child sees the father sharing with the mother. The child doesn't just do the same behavior. They might initially, but if you actually spent any time with really young kids, you know that this game isn't very fun. If a child just gives you something you don't want, though it's sweet, it's not a game you would play with other adults. So many of you, if you've been with, like, I'd say anywhere between 2 3-year-olds, they may give you like a cookie that's slobbered all over and half eaten, right? And you're like, oh, I don't want that. Like, that's not, I don't want to share that with you. And though for us, it might just seem like a silly, weird kid thing to do, from the child's perspective, they're attempting to learn to play the game of sharing. And the game of sharing isn't just following, like, oh, I give stuff to other people. That's not how that works. It's a much more complex game. To share requires several things. It first requires that you consolidate and level what your own internal motivations are. So it's like, I have a cookie. I love this cookie. This stuff tastes amazing, right? Especially for a child who hasn't had too many variants of taste, a cookie can be, like a drug. So the child has to first and foremost have enough control that they can give that up for something bigger, which is either, maybe I want to be like dad, or maybe that's what people are telling me to do, whatever. That's just the first step. The second step, which is the more complicated one, and it's the one that the father's implying with his act of sharing, is I have to then understand and embody somebody else outside of me. I need to understand, oh, I'm eating a cookie. You might want one too. I'll break this in half and I'll give you one part of the cookie, right? Or for a toy, if I'm playing with a toy and I see another child look at me, the process that has to happen is like, oh, you are looking at that. Maybe you want to play with this too. That, and in doing that, you're essentially making a simulation of someone else's brain, of someone else's mind, of attempting to understand what their motivation and their feelings might be. And then the third step, which is even more complicated, is the next is to develop a game where both your motivations and the motivations and emotions of everyone else in the game are all accounted for, where it's a mutually beneficial game. Where, for example, the cookie example, I'll split it in half. That way neither side can complain. I'll give you half, I get half, and we both enjoy this cookie. Or I'll take a turn with my toy, and then I'll give it to you, and you take a turn with your toy, and we both enjoy the same thing. And it's a mutually beneficial act. And that's, for Peterson, that's all happening when the child is attempting to imitate the father in the social realm, in the realm of society. And when I say father, it's not gender restricted. It's not even attempting to say that. It's the role of father. So single mothers are they're playing double duty, right? They're having to do two roles, and each of those sides has two different affects. So there's a lot of work that single mothers have to do, and that's why it's super respectable for the women that do that, because it is a big burden. And for Peterson, what he points out is like learning that game, for example, even just a sharing game, is a necessary requirement before you can play any mutual game. You have to be able to predict and understand what another person might want to be able to play a game, to design a game where people would actually want to play. So Peterson then points out that all this exploration and analysis of the child that they have to do highlights a big problem, because we all enter with our set of motivational subpersonalities, ones we've discussed before: rage, fear, hunger, anger, will for affiliation, all of them. And we're constantly trying to fight and find which one should rule, because, and Peterson calls these, we're ruled by a priori deities. You come in with them already there, and each subpersonality has its own goals and views. So you have to organize your subpersonalities in such a way that you can function and survive. And then the problem is that everyone has multiple motivations within them, and they're all biting for priority. So it's not just that you have to figure yourself out, you then have to be able to simulate someone else trying to figure it out. And this means that you may have contradictory motivations. For example, sibling rivalries. You may hate your brother, but you also love them and want to play. So how is it that an individual is supposed to act when confronted with conflicting and paradoxical problems? Well, for starters, let's go ahead and take a look at the 4 problems that Peterson points to. But before that, I do want to break. And Claire, do you have anything you want to throw in?
No, I think you're doing a beautiful job. And I like that Peterson refers to this sort of contrast as like we have an ambivalent relationship with this culture. And this is kind of contradiction in that there is the security, but there is the tyranny associated with it. And I think that is just sort of a lived experience that we can empathize with in how that feels to find that to both be crushed by the tyranny, but also find meaning in really everything in that benevolence. So beautifully put.
That's a great point, because I also think I grew up in a very traditional household, and my dad was always kind of more the enforcer, which I know it's not a universal thing, but it's what I mean more by the rules. It's one of the parents has to be the person that is enforcing the rules, right? One of the parents has to be the person that is like, no, you don't get to do that. And the reason you don't get to do that is because I'm going to punish you if you do. And here's the punishment. And I have to actually follow through on that. And, that's more what we mean by the father. It doesn't necessarily fall to anyone else, just that role that is played of imposing rules and order.
And I think that experience of being that child and sort of the frustration or the potential of tantrum when the father kind of puts down his fist is sort of analogous to life and culture and like the unfairness of the world. And I think we often, you often can put yourself back there of how unfair is this as a child, but then at the same time, when shit hits the fan, that's the guy you're going to, and you can kind of find comfort in.
Yeah, I always think of like the tyrannical father as the best example is normally when you're in your teens and you get the rebellious aspect, right? Because you want to fight, like that order starts to become more and more suffocating because you're wanting to do something different, something yourself. And then it's always your parents are like, are you going out like that? Are you hanging out with them? You need to be home by this time. You need to be doing this. And it's this imposition of rules that you might not agree with and might actually rebel against. But in the same way, there's a lot of rules and laws and things that fall into the same category. So moving back, so what is Peterson's problems here? And they're going to look familiar to us. But the first problem is that you have multiple gods at war within you, and yet dependent on them as they are you, right? You have a million different things. And here's where as one ex-girlfriend once told me, I didn't know that I could hate you and love you at the same time, right? It's that sensation of having two completely different perspectives, both within you and both valid. And it's almost a contradiction of like, I need to choose how to behave, but I have both two views that are making me act very differently. And it's not restricted to two. That's kind of the hard part about being human, right? You can have a bunch of different perspectives and they could all be contradictory. And then you have the next problem, which is you have others around you with their own gods at war. And yet you're also dependent on them as you're a social creature. You have to be able to count on other people. You have to be able to understand other people to survive. And then the third problem is the threat of the natural world. And yet you're also dependent on it for survival. The devouring mother is always working to destroy you. But you also need her benevolent aspect to stay alive. And then the fourth problem is your individuality is threatened by the social order and its tyranny, yet you're dependent on its structure and its protection. You want to be you naturally. That's what we've made to. But life is such that you can't just be you. Life requires you, for your survival and for the system to continue as a whole, to sacrifice parts of you, big parts of you, important parts of you, so that the whole can continue. And it's this requirement of that need that goes completely against the very thing that we oftentimes try to achieve. So you have all these problems confronting you at all times, all at once. How is an individual to navigate these conflicts? Well, the hero myth represents exactly that entity. When you watch a movie and you know the hero will succeed, why? It's because the hero is showing you an instance of navigating those problems. Another story is the failed hero myths. These are examples of strategies that may seem to work or attempting, but fail. Like we discussed last week with John and Cock-a-doodle-doo, when he has that giant ruby. We can all see why he wanted that ruby, right? It makes sense why he would take it. And if someone offered us a ruby, like we'd be like, yeah, hell yeah, like this is my lucky day. But thanks to that story, we also see why it may not be the best strategy. Another example, and this week's myth, is going to be Peter Pan. And I'm going to pass it to Victor real quick and let him take over.
Got it. So today, let's look at the story of Peter Pan. And this is a story by Scottish writer J.M. Barries. And the story essentially tells us the character, Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up. And there are many variations of the story, and we have a very good movie and the writings on it. And there are so many plot points that enrich the story itself. But here, for the sake of time, we are discussing a simplified version of the story. And the story in one of these versions, it opens with this particular phrase, which I really like. All this has happened before, and it all will happen again. But this time, it happened to Wendy, John, and Michael Darling. So this is a family, and Wendy is the elder sibling, and she is very good at telling stories, fantasy stories to her younger siblings. And she, well, in this story, the idea of repetition is what I liked. And moving on, and Wendy, John, and Michael Darling, they are in a house, and she tells all these fantasy adventure stories to her younger siblings. And here, Peter Pan is the hero of their house because he's the one who goes on these different adventures, and he succeeds in them, and he's just in a neverland where he never comes to the actual world. So this is a story of Peter Pan, and Peter Pan lives in a neverland, and this is where he has his fictional characters like Tinkerbell, his best friend. And as Wendy tells these stories to her younger siblings, one day she drops a tough news on them, saying that tonight will be the last night for all these stories. That's because I will have to go grow up, because her parents tell her to go grow up. And she drops this news. And I have to tell one more thing. So Wendy, while she was telling all these stories about Peter Pan actually hears these stories from outside of her window, and he really likes how the stories are being told. And when Wendy drops this news to her younger siblings, Peter Pan is not happy, and he jumps in and he tells Wendy that, you know what, you do not have to go grow up. There is another escape place that we can go, and you never have to come back. And that is a place where you can do anything and everything, and you can have so many adventures. Wendy's slightly interested in this, and she asks, "But how can we go there?" And Peter Pan says, "I have a friend, my best friend Tinkerbell. She can spill the magic where we can get into a ship and float away." And this is how Wendy, John, and Michael, they all float away to this Neverland. And this Neverland is an amazing, fantastical place where they meet mermaids, they meet Indians, they meet pirates, and they have a lot of fun. And at the same time, this is also a place we meet Captain Hook. And Captain Hook and Peter Pan are arch rivals. It's a characteristical thing. And he is in a ship, and we can go into his backstory. So, once they land in the Neverland, Peter Pan takes these new friends to meet his friends at Neverland. And over here, Peter Pan is the leader of the Lost Boys, and they are hiding out under a tree. And the new friends meet his old friends, and they go on and have a lot of fun. And Captain Hook, who is in a ship, he sees Peter Pan has arrived into the Neverland again, and they have a backstory. And Peter Pan is the Captain Hook is the enemy of Peter Pan because Captain Hook has a particular past. So in the earlier days when Peter Pan and Captain Hook, they get into a fight, and Captain Hook loses his hand, and he loses his hand and it falls into the ocean, and a crocodile eats away his hand. And this is a hand that has a watch, and the watch is, so crocodile swallows the hand, and the watch. And Captain Hook is really afraid of this crocodile, and he wants to run away from it. And the only way he can recognize this particular crocodile is because it has the watch and it makes the noise tick tock, tick tock. And here is the crocodile with the hand and the watch. And so here, Captain Hook wants to fight Peter Pan. So he plans a story. So he plans a plan. That is to capture Indian chief's daughter and kidnap her, so that she will tell where Pan is located, so that he can go fight him. He does the same thing, but it fails because Peter Pan comes and saves her. But now he makes another master plan, thinking that how if he kidnaps all his new friends and they will tell him where Peter Pan is located, and then he can go destroy him. That's exactly what he does. He captures his new friends, but at the same time, Peter Pan comes back. He fights Captain Hook, and he takes over the ship. There's one particular thing that we did not discuss here. Why is there a rivalry between Peter Pan and Captain Hook? Captain Hook is the captain of the ship, and he's a tyrannical, and he lost his hand, and he lost his watch, which represents the time, and it is ticking. And Peter Pan has in his place is Captain Hook, and he's tyrannical, and he does not like to grow up to become Captain Hook, and that's where he decides not to grow up. So this is the character difference between these two. So eventually, Peter Pan wins over Captain Hook, and he takes over the ship. But all of this, Wendy enjoys the whole thing, but at the same time, she is tired of this adventure, and she wants to go back, and she misses home, and she wants to go back, which actually means she wants to end this escape place. She wants to get out of this escape place, and she wants to go back to her real world. And what happens in real world? And she knows what happens next in her real world. She has to go and grow up, but still she makes a choice, and Peter Pan realizes that she wants to go back, and with the help of Bell, they will fly away in a ship, and they go back to their real world. And that's the end of the story in this version. And it's it is a very simplified version. We are missing out so many plot points, like the missing of his shadow, and so many other things. But just to give a simple overview, this is the story.
Thank you, Victor. So just a little quick recap on some of the characters, and maybe some of the things that are worth highlighting is that, for example, Wendy, who is quite actually a shared protagonist, because in this you have both the hero, which is Wendy, who is choosing the viable and correct option, and Peter Pan, who is the failed hero, the one that chooses not to. And you kind of see justifications for both. For Wendy, she chooses to return and become an adult, even though there was already victory, right? In Neverland, the evil was defeated and all this, but it wasn't real. The fantasy isn't enough. So Wendy returns to take on the real world as an adult. And then for Peter Pan, he's the boy that never wants to grow old. He wants to stay there. And we'll get into a little bit later on why that is. For the Lost Boys, I always loved this name because it sounds so cool until you actually consider what the name is implying, right? It's like a band of children where their very name states their condition. It's like they are lost. They're confused. They have no purpose. And then there's Captain Hook, who is essentially the tyrannical king who is afraid of death. And Victor made a great point about that crocodile. It's like, as again, chaos represented in a reptilian form. And what is the scariest thing? What is the most unknown of unknowns to us is death. Right? It is something that no one comes back from, and we have no idea what happens then. And it's coming, right? And it already has a piece of us. It's a fear that all adults feel, that all adults secretly harbor. So Peter Pan is and I always struggle to pronounce this because it's Latin, but pura eternus, which is the eternal child. It wants to stay in the comforts of childhood. Doesn't want to grow old. Why? Well, one of the main adults in the story is Captain Hook, who is the Devouring King, and he's just scared of death. And if that is all a child sees in adulthood, who would want to become an adult? This is why Peterson makes the case, and he also does it in the biblical series too about Moses. But this is why he makes the case as to why it's important that children respect their elders. It's not because they're elders. It's because if you don't respect that, well, that's exactly where you're heading. It doesn't matter how young or old you are, you will eventually become old if you're lucky. And if you don't respect that, what is your life going to be when you become that? Right? If you don't see the value that is held there at that point in life, then what happens when you reach that point in life? So then this lesson of respecting your elders and having respect and gratitude for the people that have come before you isn't even necessarily a virtuous, nice thing you do for others, but rather a thing that you do for yourself to set yourself up so that when you do hit that age, if you ever do, you can understand and see why it was worth getting there. And the next is he doesn't want to choose a path. And that's kind of the implication of this Neverland, of this idea where things never actually existed. It's a fantasy, an escape. Society and the culture often demands us to become something useful. Many times the things that we are pushed to become are things that we'd rather not become. The pura eternus is a tempting psychological trap to not take on the responsibility that life that is asked. So then the next question is, well, how should an individual act to navigate the 4 problems that we mentioned, earlier, and what's the risk of not doing so? And here's where Peterson, I hope everyone got to see the lecture. If not, there's one part where he really kind of just lists off all the different kinds of stories and how they're all actually attempting to address one very simple thing. Every story is always about managing change, some form of change. It can be a change in yourself. It can be a change in the environment. It can be a change in society, in your peers, anywhere really. But why is change the thing that seems so important to prepare for? Well, because anything that is a possible threat to the status quo brings with it a quality of the unknown. We know what the status quo is. We're in it. But any form of deviation or change, there's at least the speck of unknown or a massive part of the unknown. And what these stories are attempting to address is that the end is always nigh. And the end is always nigh because we don't know what could make everything fall apart, but also the changes are always happening. So later on in these lectures, we will get into the hero myth. So Peterson's kind of, as he's going through his lectures, going to keep leaving and I think as people have already noticed, arrows towards the hero myths, towards the profile of a hero. And then we'll eventually start to get into what is that. But they all seem to point to that. Now, another question, and this will be our final question for today, is why bother being a hero? You know, why not take the Peter Pan route? It seems much funner to escape into fantasy or escape into a life that we could actually want, that we would actually enjoy, rather than to throw ourselves into the hardships of reality that don't seem that rewarding. Many people fail, no guarantee of success. And even with success, it's bittersweet. And Peterson kind of gives us a couple of warnings here about this. And the first is, you can run from your responsibility that's been given to you, but it only accrues interest. the problem will either resolve itself when you're least prepared and it's finally hit critical mass that it cannot be ignored anymore, or you confront it voluntarily. That's it. You can run away as much as you want, but the cost is just accruing. And the second is, even if you don't choose, you still choose. Even if you refuse to take a side, you've already taken a side by doing that. To not take on the hero role is only to choose to wait for the problem to become so big that it can't be ignored, right? Even in the denial of, and this is for those that love Joseph Campbell, this is why there's a refusal of the call at first, right? Nobody wants to be the hero. Like, it's like, I don't want to deal with my problems. The problems suck. They're annoying. I don't like them. They're going to be effort and work, and it could end up worse. But then things get more intense and you have to respond. And the final point, and I think this is the most poignant one, is you're acting like you have a choice. You don't get to choose a safe option. There are no safe options. You only get to choose which poison you're going to take. But that's something. And with that, I'll leave it open unless Claire, you have any closing remarks or anything you want to throw in?
No, I think you wrapped that up beautifully. This is sort of tangential, but I think it's interesting. The father has sort of a gendered aspect to it, but I think that there's a lot of ways in which, femininity plays in here and takes a similar journey. And the hero, typically the hero is this knight, but I think that, Peterson talks about sort of exchanging the potential of your youth for the wisdom of your accomplishments. And I think especially for women and for the female gender, that's significant. He has that thing of like that every princess becomes the evil witch eventually. And I think that there's an element here of culture that it's scary, and aging in any regard is particularly daunting. But how can we grasp that? Because as you're saying, Roger, it will happen, right? It's coming. Right. And how can we grasp it and make it our own, and so that we can look back at the end and really feel significant about that. So just kind of bringing up that, while the father and the mother are sort of gendered, I think that there's a way that both are both.
Yeah, and that's also, just to jump onto that real quick, that's kind of the funny thing of a lot of like the criticism that gets thrown towards Peterson is that he almost always has to correct them, where he's like, oh, you're saying that females are chaotic. It's like, no, the feminine is traditionally that chaos is traditionally represented as female. And it's, so that distinction is quite important, of like, we have to consider that the gender changes and all these discussions of gender that we're having, though very relevant and very important, are also extremely, extremely, extremely new on the scale of our psychology and existence as a species. So understanding that these are very new and modern changes to things that, though no standardized form has existed in a little bit more of a distinct parts, right? So like the father and the mother roles normally had more determined with like biology and the fact that women didn't have control of their own reproduction in the same way that they do now. Is like, that was more the gendering. But then once, like in modern times, the gendering becomes less relevant because of that technology that allows us to kind of break free from those things. All right, and Shrikant?
Yes, could you stop sharing the screen? Oh, perfect. All right, so folks, we're going to do things slightly differently. What I've found is that after the breakout rooms, the quality of takeaways and questions go up. So what I'm going to do is that we're going to prepone the breakout rooms. I'm going to start the breakout rooms now, so that all the questions that you have, discuss it amongst themselves, and then bring your takeaways and questions back. So we will start off with those. So we'll start off at a much higher level, and it'll give us plenty of time to go through all of them. And here are the rules for the breakout rooms. I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Give me a second here. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. So it's time for takeaways and questions. So we're doing things slightly differently now. What we're doing is we are going to now take we've not done Q&A deliberately because we want your best considered questions after discussions. Okay. So, so we're doing takeaways plus questions combined, and it's going to be voluntary. So if you would like, so you start by giving, 1 to 2 minutes takeaway. What are you walking away with? And you can put a question on the table. You can put only question, you can do only takeaway, or both. So if you'd like to do that, go ahead and type an exclamation mark, and we will take it in the order. Once everybody has had a chance to speak, Roger and I are going to keep track of all your questions. And then we will go ahead and deal with all the questions at once. Okay. So Roger, you're fine with keeping track of questions?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay, wonderful. So Roger will do that. I'll also do that. So we'll have like 2 versions of the questions. And then Roger, you can pick whichever questions you want to answer for as long. So that way you have plenty of time to answer all the questions. All right, so it's going to be Jeff, Giampiero, and Jyoti. Jeff.
So thank you for this great session to kick off the new year. This is ridiculously appropriate, and the story of Peter Pan struck me in a way that it has never really struck me given our experience of the last year. And so my observation and then question is, first my question is, what do you, you were kind of doing it, but do you imagine that these fables kind of might elicit different morals to the story, moral to the fable from different folks? And I was, I have to tell you, I was really scared in listening to the Peter Pan story. I know the whole story, but the story was really making me feel anxious. And I realized at the end, that given the experience of 2020, the future of civilization, the ability to, across societies, create a culture that is more adult, that balances liberty of oneself and responsibility to others, is entirely dependent on people who will be Wendy. That Wendy's actually the of the story. Wendy's willing to come back and say, no, the time has come. Thanks for that. But I think I'm ready to go back and be an adult, even though I don't know exactly what the challenges might be. It's time to go back and grow up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Now, John had a question. So the question is, how can we shake up our preconceived notions? Okay, next up is going to be Jyoti. Jyoti, go ahead.
I didn't realize it was my turn.
Oh, sorry, my fault. Go ahead, Jyoti. Go ahead, and then it'll be Giampiero, and then Jean. Jyoti, go ahead.
That's what I thought. Okay. Firstly, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Victor, Clara. Great presentation and something that I can relate to. And my breakout room was very helpful. We already kind of brainstormed some questions that we were going to bring them here and, talk to each other. So my questions are, my takeout and questions are kind of multitudinal and maybe overlapping with each other. So please bear with me. I grew up thinking that Peter Pan was on the right way to go. That's just the way I was raised, and very motivated, very curious, interact with the world, find out what is going on, who are these people around me, how, and different kinds of people, and back home. And then I came here, and the same thing happened. I was in a different culture. So I left my culture, my clan. I shouldn't say culture because I still have that culture and still have the values. I would say I left my clan and to explore the world that I was placed in. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed it for the longest time. I was very progressive, married to a very progressive man. And meanwhile, I had children, and the children that I had, they followed the same trend, but their take was different than mine. I, on one hand, enjoyed so much because of my age and because of my wealth of knowledge that I had accumulated from back home. My children, on the other hand, became very lonely. They had left their, they don't know whether they left their clan or the clan left them for because the way I was, because the way my husband was. They became lonelier. And now I'm at the stage when I am not lonely, but I'm looking for security that I had left long time before. And I want to be, firstly, I'm old. I'm an older person now. I want to be comfortable in my comfort zone. I don't want to keep exploring outside unless the outside comes to me, like this kind of Zooming and my other group for the retired women. But my question to you is, down the line, you do come back to your roots. You do come back to your home. You want the security of your home. You want the security of stability. Which I did not had. I did not know what road I was taking, what adventures I was taking, and I was just like a crazy person. I don't care. I just want to do this. I want to do that, and I did, and I'm very happy I did. But I also left my clan. My clan doesn't want me anymore. They do not want me because there's a huge gap between me and my clan. I had the values, and sometimes I think my values are superior than the clan.
Jyoti,
That
sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
You
yeah,
got
yeah. I'm
about
going on and on.
45 minutes
I'm
to
going.
wrap up this whole thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just going to ask you, right? I thought for a minute I did think that I was going too far. My question to you is, what is a better way when you are in a situation like that, just to stay like have a Peter Pan syndrome all your life and be happy with it, or come back at some stage of your life? That's it.
Wonderful.
That's my takeaway. Thank you. I'm
Excellent.
sorry. Sorry
No,
about
no,
that.
no problem. No problem. Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Jean Pierrot, Jean, Stefan, and Judith. Jean Pierrot, go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. So my takeaway, and also what I would like to hear a little bit more about, is that quote from Peter Pan that all of this has happened before and it will happen again. I just love the way it sounds, and I know that there's a lot more to dig and to learn from that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jean Pierrot. Next up is going to be Jean, Stefan, and Judith. Jean, go ahead.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. I think this is very thought-provoking, this chapter, because recently I'm listening to The Drive. It's talking about how the internal drive is much more valuable to people, which we were operating on the drive 2.0, which is carrot and stick, which is not how human operating. And I see how the structure change, both in family and society. That's why we have this platform. Right now, anybody can do anything they love and do it very well. That's why we have YouTube. I found so many audiobooks on YouTube with all the great books, and people make effort to put it available. And also as a family, they said why we have such a hard time to educate children, because we no longer have a hierarchy in the family. Not like wife, mom listen to the dad, kids listen to parents. That's why we have so many parents' education, because it's no longer structured that way. Kids don't listen to parents anymore because they see the wife argue with husband all the time. So then there's no, so how it's become a flatter society, flatter family, and how in this new structure, how we operating. So the culture, how the culture affect family, that's what we try to figure out at parents' education, how we can be positive discipline, how can we give them freedom, at the same time limit their freedom. And I think same as society, we are not happy with the structure of hierarchy. We have all the YouTube and it's all flattened, and we keep PDF success Microsoft invests so much money on encyclopedia and they failed. That shows how powerful each individual is. I think the balance between the individualism and society is really start to shift, how we found. And we always admire the artists actually at Peter Pan. We saw Picasso, he's Peter Pan all his life and he's successful and we admire them, same as a lot of singers. The reason we love them because they can be true to themselves. And most of us, we can't. We have to survive, we have to conform. So that's why people inspired by them. So find the right balance so we can be true to ourselves and also fit in society. And that's the key to everybody's happiness and success.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Next up is going to be Judith, Shrikant, and Kevin. Judith, go ahead.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the way Victor presented the Peter Pan story very much because it just resonated so differently with me too, just the way it was presented. But I would say that I was Peter Pan when I was young, struggling, at the time when you have to be the Wendy and make that choice. I just don't think that I was mature enough at that time. And I knew, when I compared myself to my immediate peers where they were ready to step into the world and do things, I wasn't. And there's a lot of anxiety that goes with that. But in answer to Jyoti's question, or it seems to me you don't really have a choice because you're the adult world's going to come at you anyway. So my question is, and thankfully my two children are not at all Peter Pans, but how in this world, because we touched on this a little bit, we feel like in my group that there are so many young adults now more than ever that are wanting to stay in their parents' basement or whatever, or not, that maybe are Peter Pans. But I think that it's not the child's responsibility necessarily if they don't recognize that that's where they're at. I'm saying I'm Peter Pan in hindsight, or was, I mean. So what, as a society, then, as the benevolent fathers, do we need to add to our order and structure so that we don't create so many Peter Pans at the age we think they shouldn't be,
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. So it's going to be me followed by Kevin. If anybody else wants to share their takeaways or ask questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark. So Roger, I'm really loving your presentations. They are very essentialized, and every time you do this, I think new things, which is great. So today, I looked at your presentation on Great Father, and I realized something. I was connecting it to my study of great books. In the study of great books, there are two concepts which tower out of these 103 ideas. There are two concepts that tower over everything else. One is the concept of God, and second is the concept of state. And state really maps onto this Great Father. And throughout the entire great conversation, almost everybody would agree with the concept of Great Father. All the great thinkers would do that. But there is one big exception, and that is the founding fathers. Their notion there is actually dramatically different. I mean, as they put in Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. They're all endowed with the inalienable rights of, and these rights of pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is a crucial thing. And in order to protect those rights, governments are instituted. So you are basically, that entire way of thinking, it's the Horus-based thinking, that we are all Horuses, and we actually create our fathers and make sure that they are not tyrannical. Founding fathers were very aware of the tendency of people to turn tyrannical, people in power to turn tyrannical. Therefore, they came up with all these arrangements of elections periodically, every 4 years for the executive, and then having a legislature which puts a check on those things. So it's a way of actually making sure that the father function, which is needed, remains a benevolent function and doesn't slip into tyranny. And there is a recourse that the Horus has, and you continuously keep a watch out. They kept on saying, Republic, if you can keep it. They talked about eternal vigilance that is needed. So it's all about the eye, just the eye of the Horus. Watch that. And having this idea of a dynamic structure, that the structure is created by the seeing part in us, and you have to keep a watch on it and correct it and change it if you need to do that. And that is kind of built into their thinking at a very deep level. So that was what my observation was. Next up is going to be Kevin, Catherine, and Dave. Kevin.
Thank you, Shanka. Thank you, panel, for the great discussion. My actual one slide is very catch my eyes about the great father devoting the king. We have safety, we need soldiers to protect the security, need enforcement. That one. I would say that is just static point. I would say, let's say use time dimension. What you guys have? Let's say I'll pose my question first. What will you have different view to interpret this your the world or in the presentation compared to 20 years ago? During a breakout room, Judith, I curious about 20 years ago about the news. We got 3 channel, ABC or NBC. The news journalists try to find the facts. Compared to today, we got Fox, got CNN or other channel, which is news. We believe the news behind the fact, the truth. It's possibly it's not truth. It could be the fake news. Where's the facts? So that's one. The second one is I find all the chaos and order. The order is one considered order, another side considered chaos. For example, adult versus the youth, the feminine versus the man dominate, and the people with color with dominate another white people. How about the even in the same country, democratic map, right? So different, and that's for me. It's we possibly need a dynamic order, or reconsider chaos. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. So next up is going to be Catherine and Dave. But before that, let me just tell you what's coming up. There are 2 interesting meetups that I want to tell you about. One, immediately after this meetup, we're going to do a meetup on basic principles of literature. What makes a story work? There are 4 elements of the story. We're going to look at all the elements and how they work together. Theme of what the meaning of the story is, plot of the actual progression, characterization, and style, and how it varies and how great works of art differ in all these 4 and relationships between 4. So basic principles of literature, that is coming up at 2:30 today. Tomorrow at 2:30, we have an incredible presentation. The head of the Assisi Institute, which is a Jungian institute focused on stories, is going to be there, and he's going to be talking to Aiden about the voice of Psyche, who is knocking at the door. So it's a very deep theme. So those are the 2 meetups I would recommend. So with that, I'm going to continue. So next up is Catherine, followed by Dave. Catherine, go ahead, and you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. I love the Peter Pan story, but I do think it's very stereotypical in that all the men are seen as Peter Pans and all women are supposed to be Wendy's. So we need to integrate our Wendy and our Peter Pan personalities, more like a yin and yang, not necessarily in equal amounts. I think women's liberation helped women to escape the housebound drudgery of being a boring Wendy. And involvement in the arts allows you to escape to fantasy and have your Peter Pan side. I'm afraid of the tyranny of the excess technology that we have right now. And I think if we all carve out a little bit of time, that could balance some of the feminine in our lives. That's it.
Thank you, Catherine. Next up is Dave. And after Dave, we are going to go to Roger, Claire, and Victor answering all the questions. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Shrikant, and wonderful presentation panel. This to me is the classic coming of age story. And I think I've commented before that as a child, you look at your parents as gods because they have all the power. They're taking, the safety and security that Roger mentioned, and they're taking care of you, they're feeding you. And to me, it's like the relationship of, we talked about the Tower of Babel, and and Cain and Abel, that we want to become God. We want to be friends with gods or whatever. So we long, in some ways, to become adults, so we can do whatever we want to do. So we have control, because a lot of us have these control issues, and we get there, and then we look back and say, "Gosh, when I was a child, I could do whatever I wanted." And it's interesting. But yeah, when we're kids, we get together in kindergarten. Okay, today we're going to draw. Okay, well, I'll draw one. And then the next day, we're going to get together and sing. Oh, great, we're all going to sing. And the next day, today we're all going to dance. Oh, we're all going to dance. But when we become adults, we get in a straitjacket. We get these self-doubts. You get together with some friends. Oh, today we'll draw something. Oh, I don't know how to draw. I can't draw. Or, today we're going to get together and sing. Well, that's okay, but I don't know how to sing. Or we're going to go out with some friends and dance. Well, that's okay, but I can't dance. So it's interesting, these contradictions. But anyway, I found it very interesting as usual. And Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. All right, Roger, Claire, and Victor. You can go ahead and respond to any of the questions in any order that you choose, or you can make any comments to start with. So, Roger, I'm going to hand it over to you. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I actually just want to ask Victor and Claire if you guys should I just read these questions and then we can go through them?
Yeah.
Or see if anyone has thoughts. All right. So first one, Jeff's question was essentially: do you imagine that these fables might elicit a different moral from the story? And I'll open up to you guys first if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Well, I can see Peter Pan and Wendy as different sides of the coin, meaning one has matured and one hasn't. And to see, to straightforwardly see, we can potentially see Peter Pan as an immature person, but at the same time, just to give him a break. We can also see the idea of fantasy, the idea where we should imagine ourselves, not to just restrict ourselves into a realistic cut out world. There is a place that we can go to, an imaginary world, and have the fun, but at the same time, there is a time limit, and there is a framework around it, and we should always come back and implement it in a real world. So there is a positive and negative to each of those characters.
I just wanted to add one thing. It was amazing to see that all the questions were about Peter Pan. Mm-hmm. So that actually demonstrates the power of stories, because the stories capture the issues so perfectly and so viscerally. That's it.
It's actually the same point me and Victor were talking about, where I was saying that essentially I give you the boring background, and then the myth is the part that actually is what impacts. And that's why stories are so interesting, especially mythic stories. And kind of to hit both Jeff's point and Junipero's point, it's an archetypal story. The reason it starts with all this has happened before and all this will happen again It's the idea of it's archetypal. In other words, all of us pass through this. We all have to develop, have to grow up. We all reach this point that Wendy reaches, where it's like, hey, you can keep playing like a kid, right? No one's going to come in and stop you. But part of you knows you shouldn't. And as far as the morals go, because it's an archetypal story, it's a personality that's dealing with serious problems. You don't have to necessarily take the deepest, heaviest problem as the takeaway, right? If there's a problem that Peter Pan deals with, that's more, because another takeaway, for example, could be that what's Peter Pan's response to a tyrannical king? Well, to overthrow him, right? It's like to overthrow and fight tyranny. That is just as valuable and just as archetypal of a lesson that you can take away from that story as Wendy chooses to grow up, Peter Pan does not, right? So like that's kind of something that Peterson points this out about the Bible specifically, as he says, these kinds of stories that are full embodiments of human experience that are pretty much universal, you can just keep digging and find more and more valuable resources and valuable lessons that do imply towards a morality, but that you can just kind of not exhaust them. You can constantly find new and new wisdom that's embedded within the story itself. All right, and next one for, I think it was John, you said, how can we shake up our preconceived notions? Does anyone do you want to clarify how to, what notions we were talking about?
Jonathan had to leave, unfortunately. He just asked a question, I had to leave. But it's still a question.
In the breakout with John, though, and his suggestion was around context. And we were kind of talking about, hey, how do you, as we become more indoctrinated in a culture or a lifestyle or relationships or anything, stay curious and keep adapting and remain, hold on to that youth while still kind of trudging forward. And that context and opening up yourself to new ideas, whether that be through travel or new books or other just outlets, is a really helpful way to do that. And I think it's interesting though, because we talked earlier today, is like sometimes you don't want to, right? And I think that's the trade-off that I think about of eventually when you become stuck in your ways, you're stuck for a reason because you like those ideas. And so how can you like forcibly expose yourself to new things, even though you're like, well, I get what I get. I feel that a lot of times with Peterson, of like, in what ways has Peterson become an ideology for me, the anti-ideology ideology? And how can I combat that?
Yeah, that was actually a part that I was going to include, but I didn't know where to fit it, so I just kind of cut it out. But during the lecture, when he talked, it's one of the most horrifying ideas, but it's the fact that you die into your adulthood, in the sense that, like, when you are first born, you have more neural connections than you'll ever have for the rest of your life. So in other words, your brain is much more interconnected when you're born. And as you learn, the parts of the things that you do get reinforced, things that you don't do die off. And that's why the older we get, the more stuck in our ways we become. And it's this natural biological process, which Peterson says is like, and that's why death is a necessity for the evolutionary process. It's because eventually you are one iteration of a strategy. But for that strategy to be tried, it has to be solidified. And then after that, you either pass it on to your kids, and then you pass away and your kids take on the strategy that you had, but then take on all the novel new information that's also there. And then they fall into their rigidity, and then over and over and over again. And it's that process of falling into who you are, which is also a terrifying idea of like every choice matters, even just for the sake of every choice defines who you will become. Right.
Okay. So it's going to be Jeff followed by Judith next. Folks, keep your comments very short at this point because we want to make sure that we go through this entire cycle of questions, and we've got only about 20 minutes left. Jeff, go ahead.
So Roger, I just want to follow up to your point. Two things. One, I think that one of the essential pieces of falling into the adulthood is this notion of learning the right things from our experiences. that, one of my greatest challenges with adults is they've learned things from their experiences, and I think those are not such great things. So learn the right things from your experience. And then second, I find myself constantly encouraging adults to stay curious rather than to get locked in to their opinions or conclusions. And I'll let it rest there. But I think, the preparation of childhood should really be empowering adults to be better adults, to be a better Wendy. And I think that there are leaders, at least in the American culture right now, who are inviting us, who are seeking their best to be Wendy. And but you got to learn the right things from our experience and stay curious moving forward. It's all about iteration.
All right. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to have Roger, Claire, and Victor complete everything, and we will take all comments afterwards. So that way we can get through this entire, all amazing questions that have been put on the table first. So sorry about the interruption. Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah. So speed round for Joy T. Her question is essentially, I've left my clan, and which one is better, right? To leave and be adventurous and kind of escape the norm and then eventually come back, or to stay there in the security and in the safety. And the interesting part is I'm going to jump to Jung here. And normally I lean on Jung because that's Peterson's main structure too. But for Jung, he believes that that's exactly what the midlife crisis is a flip of what your strategy was. Is if you're someone who's extremely adventurous as youth, really rambunctious and wild when you're young, you hit that midlife crisis and you realize, like, Jesus, I'm getting way older. I need to slow down. I need to grow up. Like, what the hell am I doing? Like, I'm acting like a kid still. And then the flip side is, if you're someone who always played it safe, who never tried to actually live anything, who always just did what everyone else told you to do, and then you hit your midlife crisis, it's like, Jesus Christ, I'm halfway dead. I haven't done anything. I haven't lived my life. I've been doing what everyone else has been expecting me to do, and I haven't even enjoyed any of this, and I'm already halfway done. And then it's the flip side. So it's the buying the sports car, dating the 20-year-old, like the really like crazy rambunctious aspect. And I think for me that is kind of how both sides or both choices kind of self-correct. Right? If you choose safety, as you get older, eventually you'll get the benefits of safety, you'll also have the urge for jumping into the chaos. And if you choose the chaos, eventually you'll start to really see the appeal of order.
And this calls back to that primal orientation that Peterson wants us to lay on, is the precipice between order and chaos, being right at the foundation of that wall with one foot kind of hangling out into chaos to allow those two to balance.
All right. And Jean, she was kind of talking about how everything's kind of more even, and that essentially society's starting to have issues, especially with the family, because everything's so even that there's no organizational structure that helps us. For Peterson, he kind of sees this as one of the consequences of the collapse of the gender roles. And before I even go down this route, because this is basically radioactive stuff, it's essentially he's not saying that this is good or bad. He's simply trying to describe something that's going on. And from his perspective, he says, look, never in our history have we ever had control of our reproduction. Once that happens, some of the main rules of the entire game that we've evolved to, the game that our psyches and everything were developed to, completely changes, right? Now women can, now there's not that big of a difference between women and men. If women can choose to have a kid when they want to, and it's up to them, well, then the biggest difference between the genders is an optional difference. And so now all the gender roles that used to be like, look, you're the one that has to have the kids, so you're going to have we're going to nurture them. And it's this weird slight division of roles. Now women, rightfully so, are like, seems like I'm doing a lot of the work, and now I also have to work. This doesn't seem fair. Like, what exactly are you doing? And there's a renegotiation of all these rules and all these expectations. But Peterson points out a big problem here, and something that he's concerned of. And he says, most people, like, if you don't have the already established roles where you just go in and you know what you're expected to do, it's like, that's fine. But that means you have to negotiate your roles. That means within every partnership, you have to talk. It's like, hey, I'm going to do this part. You're going to do that part. I'm going to do this. And he points out that most of us aren't good at that, especially if you're agreeable. You're not very good at negotiating and advocating for yourself. It's like, so now you don't have a structure to guide you, and you don't have the skill sets to develop a new structure. It's like, that's going to be a lot of tension. It's going to create a lot of problems. It's like, it might end up for the better. He's not saying that it's a bad thing. He's just saying it's like, that's kind of currently what our culture is going through. It's that very big dynamic shift. But I think that, Gwen's kind of pointing to that. It's like, or Gene, sorry, is pointing to that is where that's kind of what we're seeing within our current families. Do you have anything, Claire?
No, you hit that perfectly.
All right, and Judith asks, what's the role of society to help Peter Pan's or man children kind of grow up and grow out of it? Anyone have any thoughts, Victor or Claire?
I mean, I think stories are huge here. We already touched on this, and that goes back to that first point in the video of culture is 200,000 years old. Written word is what, 5,000. What happened in that other 100,000 years? I bet it was a lot of storytelling. And so I think that that's one element that, cultural rules and laws and religion, it's so easy to resist those. But a good story is really powerful, and I think will carry on forever.
Yeah, I would kind of agree to that end. And I think this is why Peterson became so famous, especially when he did, is most, especially young men here, grew up in a place where, most people probably under 20 grew up where YouTube was widely available. The atheist movement had already really taken over in the United States. So they don't really have a good reason to do things that are should or they expected. And they grew up in a time when all these shoulds that are in our society are being questioned. It's like, why should I do any of this? And I think Peterson kind of came in and it's like, look, all those old stories that your parents believed in? Yeah, okay, you don't have to believe in all the like crazy stuff that made you not believe in it. It's like, but there's still some lessons here that have been useful the entire time. Take it out of that context and just look at the lesson. And can you understand why this is valuable? And that's much more intuitive and much easier. And I think that's genuinely, one, Peterson's aim, but two, why he's an international best-selling author. And a lot of people are really excited about it is because he's able to show us and pull out lessons from things that are religious or used to be religious, and then point them in a non-religious way where it still makes sense and is still convincing to us. And other question, Shrikant, yeah, you didn't have so much a question, but a good point of like how the founding fathers conceptualized this idea that there's God-given rights that the state then protects. It's the state's responsibility to protect.
No, I mean, the way in which God, the founding fathers think is that individuals, God gives individuals or nature gives individuals these rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then they create the state in order to protect the rights for everybody. So the causation is the other way around. So it's the Horus, the I, that is actually saying, okay, right, Osiris needs to be brought back. Okay, Osiris is getting senile. Okay, Osiris is being taken over by Seth. Let's do something about it. So it's like it's the entire mindset focused on it's the way of thinking about politics and society, about politics using, which is Horus centric.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I'm guessing that's a reflection of every couple, I think it was like 20 years or something, like it's like it has to be refreshed with the blood of revolutionaries, essentially, that like the system constantly has to be updating and being renewed.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that they have come up with systems which don't actually have to go to the blood level.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But stop before that. You know, there are all kinds of other checks and balances which actually take care of it before it gets to that.
Yeah, well, like I think that's just, I mean, taking a couple steps back, you're still functioning within the Great Father from my perspective, because the fact that there is a God that grants you these rights, from my perspective, is like, yeah, that's, if there is a God, he would give me these things. It's like, okay, well, you're already following something and implying that that's how things should be. That thing that you're following, where did it come from? Where did you get it? Why do you believe that? Right. And it's like, that's still the order that you're attempting to establish, the order and known domain that you're attempting to establish. But I think in seeing it that way, it puts front and center, like you said, the Osiris strategy of like, yeah. No matter what we build, we need to constantly be updating it, because the environment is constantly shifting. And if we don't update this thing very quickly becomes tyranny. We essentially have like a massive, like it's like a nuclear weapon that will go off if we don't maintain it.
Excellent. So folks, we still have a little bit of time for more comments and questions, especially if you have not talked about your takeaways or comments or questions before. This is your last chance. We got maybe about 6-7 minutes to wrap up, but it has to be very brief. Laura, you have a question? Nope. Okay.
Kevin had one more.
Okay, Kevin had one more. Okay, give me just a second. Let me first tell you about what's coming up. It's going to be, so the next one is we're going back to Thursdays now. And next Thursday, we're going to do a review. So the question for all of us is going to be, what have you learned about maps of meaning so far? What have you learned from maps of meaning so far? So that's one. And second is, what are the big questions that you have about this entire approach, about the crucial concepts within it? So that's what we are going to do this Thursday. All right. So Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, just he had several points, but from what I understand, one of the main points that he was essentially making was the somewhat subjective aspect of chaos and order, that certain things can be orderly to some, but then chaotic to others. One of the things that I think I heard him bring up was essentially systemic racism within the United States. Although I would still make the case that like that's order from both perspective, it's just a different affect, right? Like from maybe like general white America, they perceive that as like, no, it's and I think that's why you see the political divide too. It's like they see it as like, hey man, every time I see a cop, they're doing their best to like keep the peace, to do well. And from someone in a Blacker people of color community, they might see it the exact opposite. It's like, no, this is a tyrannical system. This is a tyrannical system that is constantly not allowing me to even just live. It's constantly oppressing me. So I still think, and I do agree that there's certain aspects of that may appear orderly to one person, but disorderly to the other. And I think that what we need to consider is that the chaos and order distinction is within the individual, right? I don't like chaos and order as much as mapped and unmapped territory. In other words, can you predict what is going to happen in the place you are? If you can, you're in order. If you cannot, you're in chaos. And more than likely, when you're in chaos, there's a physical affect that you have, which is normally fear, anxiety, stress of some form, mostly because of the unknown. And then he also talked about the facts, that fake news and facts can often be hidden. And I think that goes back to the same idea that if you ignore a dragon, it just grows. If you ignore a problem, it just grows. And I think the best example of that is COVID. You can look at all these countries, Russia, Mexico, Brazil, where they just decide to hide it and try to hide it. It's like, yeah, that's not how things work. You can lie to your citizenry as much as you want, but all that's happening is more of them will die and more of them are dying. And eventually, if you don't address that, there will be a tipping point. Right? It just continues, like there's just dividends that has to be paid over and over the longer it goes.
We've seen that for sure.
Okay. Laura, you had a quick question?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, I would say, how much this fable or whatever really does, I think, parallel much of our lives. I mean, if you go back and sort of look at your own life, I think you can really map to it. I mean, I can. I wasn't a rebellious kid, but I can tell you from age 19 to the present, I have been Peter Pan life. I have made every decision on my own. I have taken every path I've wanted. I mean, I'm still Peter Pan. I'm still whatever I want, you know, whatever I see, I want, I go that path. I don't know that I'll ever meet up with Wendy. I'm not sure. And I like it. It's keeping me young. I don't know, but I think that this has been a great period. You know, I can really thank you for, you know, taking what a psychologist would take months and years to look at in my life. I've really been able to review.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's been a great.
Thank you. Next up, so I want to just follow up on one last thing. A comment that Roger made, and I want both kind of Claire's and Victor's and Roger's take on this. You said, you know, instead of order and chaos, you preferred mapped and unmapped. And I've also been thinking about that because, you know, see, the great thing about kind of diving deep into something like this, maps of meaning, you get to kind of closely examine the concepts that you're using and see which ones actually capture what you're thinking better. And for me, it is kind of I always think of it in terms of known and unknown. So unknown is because what it does is that, you know, Victor did a great job of pointing this out, that chaos has this negative connotation, whereas something like unknown or potential does not. And I think that's important because it's important not to look at the unknown with trepidation, because the unknown also has all the positive things. You know, you can't let, you know, otherwise it is kind of fear-based stuff. So, so what are your preferred ways of thinking about this? So mine is known and unknown. It looks like Roger's is mapped and unmapped, but Roger can add to it, and then Claire and Victor.
Yeah, so mine isn't so always mapped and unmapped. For me, I think chaos and order works best because it is the most applicable. Like, you can apply it to everything. So if you're talking about myths, it works. You're talking about psychology, it works. You're talking about personal experience, it works. So it's the broadest sense. So I understand why Peterson picks it. But I think once you start talking about specific fields, like for me, I'm a huge psychology buff. So for me, I always imagine it first and foremost, what us as animals are emotionally reacting to. And what we're emotionally reacting to is like, do I know what's happening here? Am I safe? But to know that you're safe requires that you at least believe that you know what's going to happen next. And when you don't have that security, panic sets in. But yeah, it depends on the situation, which terms I prefer.
Claire?
I agree. There's something about chaos that speaks to the sort of emotive quality that you feel when you're in it, in that you can't, and unmapped works there too, which is just like everything falls apart, right? That even the things that were in order somehow become more sort of complicated. And so I think, you know, there's all these sort of more emotional terms that I think about in those times of chaos. Order to me is more clear, right? It's cemented. But I think, yeah, I like unknown as well. I don't know, I'll have to think about it.
Victor.
Well, I think in terms of real and potential, for sure. And one more thing is what is and what can be or what should be. So those are the things that those are the lenses I look through. And the medium is usually play through the things and get to that.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, folks, so this was a great meetup. I wanted to let you know that at 2:30 in a few minutes, we're going to start the meetup on basic principles of literature. So if you read fiction, if you like stories, it's about the structure of stories. You know, with Jordan Peterson and Jung, we've been talking about the meaning of stories. This is about how do stories actually carry out that meaning. So once it has a certain theme, how is it that a plot achieves that? And how do great authors design characters, a set of characters, cast of characters to execute that? And the most complex and interesting part is the concept of style. Each author has a unique style, which actually reflects their psychoepistemology, or their way in which their mind works. And you can, like many times in visual arts or stories or music, you can hear see a little bit and say, oh, that is Picasso, or that's Beethoven, just with that little snippet. So that's what the style is. And so there are these 4 elements, and how do these 4 elements play together to create literature? So that's what we're going to be talking about. So again, thank you very much. And again, for the next one on Jordan Peterson, Maps of Meaning, is Thursday. And we're going to be talking about what have we learned so far, and what are the big questions on our minds as a midday. Then we will continue with Maps of Meaning until it is over. And as soon as the new book comes out, we are doing chapter by chapter in the new book. All right.